Hello, story seekers. I'm Nico.
I'm Ben, and you're listening to The Tiny Bookcase.
Our guest for this episode has a deep love for anything weird, anything that pushes boundaries, and anything that makes him cry.
He's lived all over the world, in places like Singapore, Switzerland, and Hong Kong, but now resides in Edinburgh. His most recent novel, Ascension, is a mind-bending speculative thriller, which has also been optioned for a movie. It's coming out in April. We would like to warmly welcome Nicholas Binge.
Hello, Nick.
Hi, guys. How are you?
Very good. All the better for speaking to you. I have just read the first chapter of Ascension.
Oh, fun.
And I was kicking myself that I didn't make more time for it earlier, because you hooked me immediately. I really, really got into it. Like, legitimately, I'm not fluffing you at all here. I'm really, really enjoying that book.
No, Ben, let's
thanks, man. I
reframe what
appreciate
you
that.
actually did. What you actually did, Ben, was read the start of Nick's work and then put the fear of God in yourself and then share that with me.
Yes, that is exactly what I did. That's a little twitch behind the curtain for you there, Nick. But it's fantastic. So that's going to be coming out in April next month. As well, yeah, we're still just about in March, aren't we? In both UK and abroad. What?
Yeah.
What sort of drew you to writing speculative fiction?
That's a really good question. No, I've always written. I suppose I've always written to some degree or another. When I was at school, I was writing bits and bobs and trying to write short stories and some particularly poorly judged forays into poetry, and things like that, and scripts and things. But when I was, God, I must have been about 25, I was like, okay, I'm gonna sit down and write a novel. And the first thing I wrote was actually a full, proper, swords and magic fantasy, because that's what I loved reading when I was a kid. It seemed obvious to me. I mean, when I was a teenager, I devoured pretty much all the big fantasy series and a lot of the kind of the golden age sci-fi as well, as a lot of teenagers do. But I would pick up series of like 10 books long fantasy series and just absolutely live inside of them. And so when I started writing it, it felt that was the obvious thing to write. And I wrote one and I thought it was quite good. I look back at it now and I'm like, that's a derivative piece of nonsense. But I thought it was quite good at the time. I never really went anywhere. And then I decided to write another novel, and that was also kind of fantasy, but getting a little bit, I suppose, weird is the term. You get these authors like Jeff Vandermeer who have kind of coined this term weird when they talk about their work, and I'm kind of my work tends to kind of delve into a similar sort of space at times. And I kind of had to take a step back and be like, why am I trying to write fantasy? Because I don't really read that much, or at least at the time, I didn't really read that much fantasy anymore. I think I was trying to capture something about my youth that wasn't quite true to who I was as an adult. And so I was like, what do I actually read as an adult? And as an adult, I read a lot more kind of, I suppose, experimental fiction, a lot more literary fiction, a lot more stuff that kind of plays around quite consciously with structure and form and gets really weird. And so kind of speculative thrillers felt like a way to capture a little bit of my youth still and kind of bring those fantasy elements in, bring those sci-fi elements in, but still give myself a kind of a broad remit to say, well, you know what, I'm not gonna stick with these tropes, or I'm not gonna do this thing that I would expect in a fantasy novel or a sci-fi novel. I'm gonna do this completely other weird thing. I'm gonna write it in this way. I'm gonna write it as a memoir, or I'm gonna add a load of, I don't know, footnotes into it. I'm gonna do something strange like that. And once I gave myself kind of that freedom, I suppose, everything just fell kind of place. It felt quite natural, and ever since then, that's kind of been the place where I've been writing.
I really enjoy that concept of you just sort of like rediscovering what you actually will be good at, if that makes sense, rather than just what initially set you on the path. That's quite encouraging, I think.
Yeah, it was very much. It was a moment of rediscovery, and it was a moment of conscious reflection of what it was that I enjoyed about books and what it was that I wanted to put into books, rather than just what it was initially, which was just I want to write something, and that was my first step.
Well, the stories beckon, chaps. Regular listeners know how it goes, but for those of you joining us for the first time, there will be 3 stories told in this episode. All of them have been written to the same shared prompt, and this week the prompt is flags. Ben, you're up first.
Flags. George wasn't right, and couldn't remember why. It had all started after leaving the Navy. He'd pored through his redacted medical records in the big binder they give you when you leave. The mostly censored document had been in there with his tax information and details on the generous support he had earned from the government for his service. A free-to-rent room in a shared halfway house in central London, gym membership, shopping deliveries, meal plans, an unlimited data plan on a state-of-the-art phone, and a hefty pension. 35 and minted. That's what all the lads had thought when they went in at 18. 35 and sorted for the rest of your life. What, 17 years, eh? George couldn't fucking tell you. They'd scrubbed it from him, like skid marks on white undies. He knew, from what few details remained in his file, that he'd undergone some treatments near the end of his service. Those had just been run-of-the-mill simple gene edits, though, to remove a pesky strain of Huntington's from the hand of genetic cards George had been dealt. He'd always known that would be the deal. 17 years of doing whatever they wanted you to do, and then boom, your hippocampus gets a nice deep clean, and you're out the door to live the rest of your life on Union Jack's bankroll. Except it wasn't living. He was tired all the time, and sometimes it would come in big waves that meant he had to sit down or he'd fall over. After the second set of scalp stitches, George had learnt that sitting was the better option. None of the other blokes that passed through the halfway house had experienced problems like him. They'd all spent no longer than a year there before finding a partner and moving on. Gone to live in a sunshine land of peace. They'd forgotten all they'd done to protect. No PTSD, no crippling fatigue, no nothing. George found himself spending more and more time sat on the pavements of the streets he thought he'd be striding down with money in his pocket. Sometimes he didn't make it back to the house at night, so he'd write little messages on the concrete to himself and others wherever he sat. Just then he was letting his marker scribble out what little history he knew about himself. Born 1991, adopted 1994, fostered 2004, Children's Home 2005, Royal Navy 6th of September 2009. And underneath it he wrote, "The rest of it till now you'll have to ask the Royal Navy." He wrote those last 2 words in big letters that took up an entire concrete slab to themselves. George realised he was breathing hard from the effort and set his pen down as the tiredness came on. When he woke up, it was still daytime, and he suspected it might even be the same one. A patter of small raindrops had awoken him, and he stared up at the grey sky, wondering whether he'd get soaked whilst he sat there. Across the street, the big red flag of the Chinese embassy fluttered in the mild weather. He knew why he'd come. He'd just need to wait until he was capable of crossing the street to do it. Some of the lads he'd shared the apartment with, those with suspicious and curious minds, had regurgitated some of the same rumours he'd heard all those years ago, that the Chinese had a way of reversing the scrub. People said they'd look after you just as well. All you had to do was get debriefed. He'd dismissed it at first, despite having long since lost any vestige of patriotic loyalty. But as the tiredness worsened, and none of the doctors would tell him what was causing it, the concept had grown into an obsession for him. He thought that just maybe, if he knew what he'd done and where he'd been, that he'd be able to figure out what was causing the tiredness. George had been trying to learn Mandarin for the last 6 months because of it, using an old book he'd bought in a dilapidated second-hand shop near Camden. He knew there were all sorts of ways to learn a language now. They could probably even put a chip in your head. he dismissed those options, as they'd all be tracked and monitored, as everything he did probably was. That thought still tripped him up whenever it streaked across his conscious mind. He'd never been a conspiracy nut, or anything even close to one, before the Navy. But contemplating getting debriefed by the Chinese was almost certainly treason, right? Two middle-aged men stepped around him whilst having a conversation, snapping him from his reverie. George looked at them and saw their glances slide off him. He immediately forgave them for thinking he might be a beggar, and that any eye contact would buckle them into a roller coaster of moral conundrums and societal guilt. Something else called to him, though. What if they'd known him? What if he'd spent every waking minute with one of them for 17 years? They'd have no way of knowing what they'd meant to each other. He watched the men walk on, no doubt trying to forget the uncomfortable moment they'd all shared. George stood up. It was slow going, but he got there. 6 shuffling steps took him to the middle of the road. When he stopped to catch his breath, he heard a big lorry thundering towards him and hunched against the potential impact. He found himself half hoping the driver might lose control of his haulage and plough him into the tarmac like the barren seed he was. The monstrous thing ripped past him instead, honking with the driver wailing curses. The whoosh of it nearly tipped him backwards, but George remained upright and then shuffled forwards to mantle the curb with great effort. He sighed and looked apprehensively at the gate that guarded the big wooden door of the embassy. In a secure booth on a black site in Wales, a ping drew the operator's attention to her second screen. "We've got a red flag outside the Chinese embassy. Looks like a sleeper, according to his vitals." She threw the words over her shoulder, and her supervisor quickly appeared at her back. "Pull his records and show me." She did so, and the two of them glanced through it. It didn't take more than a few lines to know what had to be done. "Yeah, that's not going to fly. Do it." George stumbled as the chip embedded in his skull received the signal and superheated. White-hot nanosolder flooded in a scorching tide through the pathways of his brain. George sprawled, falling asleep for the last time.
It was so bleak.
I love that. I love bleak. I'm all about that.
You're about bleak.
Yeah. Love it when everyone dies at the end. I enjoy that a lot.
Thank you,
Was Paycheck by Philip K. Dick a conscious inspiration?
Not read it. I've read quite a lot of Philip K. Dick, but not read that.
It's a similar idea. It's a guy who goes to do a job basically rather than from the Royal Navy. He goes to work for a company, but the agreement is like a really intense NDA where they wipe all his memories at the end of it. So he can't remember what he did in a period of time.
Damn, that is very similar. Okay.
I thought you were doing a conscious homage there, but
I've not read it. No, I've not touched it.
Turns out you're just subconsciously one of the greats.
I'm subconsciously a dick. Yeah.
There's some really good introspection on depression stuff in there. There was a great line where he said that it's still daytime, and he suspected it might even be the same one. And it's that kind of temporal meaninglessness that comes with being in a situation where you don't feel like you can get out or improve. It's like it doesn't really matter to him if it's the same day, but that's just, it's something to fill the time with, is guessing how long he's been blacked out. That's a really nice small detail, but it does paint those broader strokes. I really like that line.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think in addition to that kind of that with that depression theme that you were going for, or that at least came through in the story, I thought that image of him sitting potentially in the rain, writing messages on concrete beneath him, kind of graffitiing his life onto concrete to try and work it out and trying to get a sense of it, was a really evocative image that really stuck with me at the end of the story.
Thank you. So that bit was quite interesting. I actually had an entirely different story ready to go last week for this recording, and 2-3 days ago, I was walking through town. I live in Cambridge, one of the main streets, and I saw written in marker on the floor by John Lewis that bit that I read out. The born 1991 adopted foster
Wow.
children with the Royal Navy thing, and I looked down and I assumed it was like you know like a a homeless person or someone that's sort of begging, and they hadn't had card or something, so they were writing out what they
Yeah.
what their story was in front of them. But the angle of it was such that it would have been written just for the reader, basically, like for the person that was writing it, like, so it wasn't pointed at the sort of traffic walking past it, and it just stuck in my head. I took a picture of it, and I thought that's not going anywhere anytime soon, because it really messed with me. This idea of somebody writing that on the pavement, and there was nobody there, but it was clear that it had been done relatively recently.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm glad it wasn't the case. I really thought you were going to say you looked at it and then you realized it was viral marketing or something.
Yeah, well, it had occurred to me that something like that might happen. So
Yeah.
I was almost afraid to write this story in case I'd been really thick and missed what the point of that was. But
Accidentally doing product placement somehow.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I'm doing
weird-
recruitment drive for the Royal Navy right now.
I wonder if any companies have considered that. Like, oh, well, we've got Avengers 19, this time it's a dragon or whatever, and we want signs everywhere. Like, there is a huge houselessness problem in this country. Like, just say, hey, we'll give you £100, hold this sign all day. People would do it.
Well, that's a plot line from a Always Sunny episode, I think. Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I think Frank Reynolds pays a bunch of
Maybe that's why it's in my
what he
brain.
refers to as bums to go around with placards on them advertising.
Yeah.
I think
But
if
yeah,
you're coming up with the same ideas as Frank Reynolds, you might have to question your ethics to some degree.
So anyway, I started blasting.
Anyway, so I just had to chuck away the other story basically, because I'll probably reuse it for something at some point, but this was going nowhere to the point where I wasn't really capable of editing the other story, so I just had to write this one.
I love that, and I love that. Actually, for me, that was the most evocative moment of your story, not knowing that it was real or fiction, thinking it was fiction, and I think that speaks to me. That speaks so much to the way that so often in storytelling, the most evocative stuff is the stuff that's real, right? The stuff that we take from real life, that's often stranger and more bizarre than whatever fiction we end up writing. I think it's perfect for that.
Sort of a bit like lying, isn't it? You sort of want to sprinkle a few truths in there to make sure it rings true. But yes, no, it's I was blown away by it, and I had to think about it, and I was just, and then that led to me to just sort of think, like, what if you literally do have to ask the Royal Navy because he doesn't know? Like, I don't know. It was it was a lot. And I sort of wanted to put it a little bit into the future so we can sort of see that sort of, same shit, different year. But yeah, I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, I did write down the line, like the barren seed he was. It was very near the end, but that's a good line, man.
Well, when he wants to be ploughed into the tarmac, yeah.
Yeah, but but there's nothing that can grow from him. There's no potential left in it. It would just be something to be pressed into the earth. That's a good line.
Yeah, I really liked that image.
Thank you. Well, I think that's quite enough of me and mine. Nick, do you reckon you're ready to give us your story?
Yeah, definitely. Get it up in front of me.
This is already getting confusing.
No. Have I yet called you Nick, Nico? It's going to get really confusing when I call Nick Nico, though.
Out for that one. All right. Okay, cool. Flags. We were in Moscow on our honeymoon when I first saw their flag. Our flight got in at 5 a.m. and we checked into the Metropole Hotel in pitch black. Like spies, Lucy joked with that wry little smile of hers. Like secret agents. When we woke up the next morning, the flags were everywhere. A white background with a small black triangle. Overnight, on the walls and windows of corner shops and lampposts, they hung like gargoyles, announcing it's coming. Tiny white flags littered the streets, hundreds of them, covering the city in a blanket of snow or ash. Beneath the symbol, they read, "On the 4th, Uyajin will perform." No one could say where they came from. The staff at the Metropole cleaned them up immediately, but when interrogated, they simply shrugged their shoulders as if to say, "What can we possibly know about such things?" Lucy was fascinated. Despite my protestations, she stole one of the flags and brought it to our room, marveling in wonder at it. She said we had to go. Only there was no other information about them. No ticketing, no venue, no mention of which 4th or of what month. We didn't even know what it was. But this was why I had married Lucy, wasn't it? I marvelled at her desire to see the world, to experience new things, so I let myself surrender to her. She wanted to see Uyajin perform, she told me, no matter the cost. Consider it a wedding gift, she said. We had to wait a whole week before the 4th. "What do you think will be in the show?" she asked me for the 100th time as we watched the snow drift down onto the Moscow streets. Music? Dancing? I wanted to tell her that it made me anxious, that there was this ball at the pit of my stomach that tightened and tightened with each passing day, but I didn't because I had no way to explain it and it was ridiculous. "I already said I don't know," I replied. "I know as much as you do." "Well, obviously," she laughed, leaning her head into mine. "I'm asking you to imagine. You are capable of that, aren't you? God, you're such a machine sometimes." "I'm not." I did my best to put on a grumpy face. The truth is, I loved it when she chided me. I loved it when she did just about anything at all. "Love you," she said. "Love you more." "Not possible," she replied. "With you," I said, "anything is possible." It was our little refrain, those 4 lines. A call and response, like the sing-song patterns of birds or the calls of whales. We both knew it didn't make sense. I don't even know how it started, but I couldn't imagine a world where we would stop saying it. On the morning of the 4th, she woke up so early. She didn't get out of bed because she knew it would annoy me, but I could tell she was wide awake beside me, pretending to keep her eyes closed. It was so absurd, like a child pretending to still be asleep on Christmas Eve so Santa would visit. It made me uncomfortable, but what could I possibly say? "I don't like how much you're looking forward to this." I mean, the words sounded stupid in my head. There was no doubting where to go. The pavilion tent erected in the Vorobyovi Gori was like nothing I'd ever seen in my life. Brilliant flaming reds and azure blues patterned across the silk, each panel framed by a golden border that glittered in the springtime sun. Above, the distinctive white flag flew. We bought our tickets at the entrance and walked in. Lucy's hand was tight on my arm as we entered the first corridor. It led to a complex maze of openings and turnings, tents within tents within tents, a subtle labyrinth that swallowed us whole. We were quickly separated from others and before long ended up entirely alone. So we explored. It was a museum of impossibilities. Each successive chamber featured some crazy new wonder, a room of bubbles that grew and shrank depending on how close you got to them, disappearing to nothingness if you tried to touch them. A burning bonfire that was completely cold to the touch. One just held a young boy who identified himself as Dmitri and said nothing more. We stood some 5 meters away from him and watched as he stood up and took off his shirt. He was scrawny, his pale skin tight against his ribs. Slowly, he turned his back to us and opened up a giant pair of magnificent gossamer wings. They grew out of his spine, and their span took up the entire room, glittering and shimmering in the light. Lucy laid her head against my shoulder as we stared in awe, surrendering ourselves to the moment, and I whispered, "I love you." "I love you more," she replied. "Not possible." "With you," she said, watching the boy's wings stretch before us, "anything is possible." After what must have been several hours of delight and discovery, we started to see other visitors again. Masked attendants ushered us ahead, now with many others, as the tent opened to the largest chamber we had come across yet. The coloured silk rose in the middle to a high point, and on the ground there was a clear performance space delineated, surrounded by cushioned seats. Once we were settled, a trumpet sounded, and out of a flap in the tent, a man walked in. He walked like a marionette with invisible strings, his arms and legs rising and falling to an unnatural degree. His face was painted in whites and reds, with bright blue eyeliner beneath his eyes and brilliant rose eyeshadow. He was bald, but for the flaming patch of red hair just above his ears, and his loose, brightly coloured clothes billowed around him like sails in the wind. Behind him came a giant white cat. I would not have believed it to be real if I hadn't just seen so many other impossibilities. It was the size of a Great Dane or a leopard, and its steps seemed to match the movement of the man it followed, almost perfectly like a choreographed dance. When the man reached the centre of the stage, he bowed. A voice sounded from all around us, though I could see no speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," it said, "Auguste the Clown." He gave another bow, and then another, and we all clapped. Perhaps the most surprising thing, after all the magical and otherworldly sights we had just encountered, was how funny he was. He was hilarious. He did not speak a word, but with a variety of routines involving his giant cat, an attempt to make a bowl of soup, and some sleight of hand so deft my eyes could barely follow, he had us rolling about in laughter. Lucy clutched to me, desperately trying to breathe. For his next trick, the announcement sounded again, Auguste will require a volunteer. Many hands shot into the air. Not all, mine certainly did not, but Lucy's arm was straight up and rigid as a tree trunk. When Auguste pointed at Lucy, she practically squealed in delight. Her hand left my arm, and I realized that for the first time since we'd entered this tent, she was no longer touching me. And despite the warmth and laughter and magic, a chasm opened inside me. And with each step she took towards the stage, my heart dropped, and the ball that had been tightening in my stomach this past week twisted violently, and I had to force myself to breathe. I didn't move. I didn't want my neuroses to ruin this for Lucy, because I knew how much she'd be loving it. It'll be fine, I told myself. It'll be over in a flash. When she reached Auguste, he put her hand out to take hers. She stepped towards him. In the other hand, he pulled a knife out of his billowing clothes and plunged it straight into her heart. The audience gasped. "Lucy!" I screamed as she slouched forward, blood dribbling from her lips, but I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, stuck in ice, tied in knots. My feet were glued to the floor by some strange magic, and all I could do was watch. Her body collapsed into Auguste's arms. He held her, turning her corpse, cradling it like a child. The head lolled back, the arms starfished outwards. There was blood, but surprisingly little. It stained her shirt and her clothes, but not a drop touched the performance floor. Lowering the body slowly, almost lovingly, he placed it on the ground. And for a moment she looked serene, as though she might be sleeping, if not for the bright red patch over her chest. My whole body strained against invisible ropes. But from somewhere, as if out of thin air, he produced an accordion, and standing over the body he began to play a slow, mournful, almost biblical tune which echoed around the room, and the cat began to dance. It was unlike any movement I have seen before in my life. The giant beast lifted its paws one by one, rhythmically as if it were walking, 2 at a time, then 3. It twisted back and forth behind Auguste, then around the body, the great head swaying this way and that to the sonorous rhythm. And then suddenly, almost without circumstance, without any thought given to it at all, Lucy's corpse disappeared. As one, the audience sucked an intake of breath. It rushed through the room like a gust of wind, and the body was back, exactly where it had been, except this time, it sat up. Lucy sat up. She blinked, looking left and right, disoriented. Her hand went to her chest, where there was still a patch of blood, but no longer a wound. She was alive. She was fine. Rapturous applause exploded across the small theatre. Howls and calls and whoops sounded from the crowd. Auguste gave 3 short bows and helped Lucy up to her feet. I was not applauding. Instead, I stared in horror as he took another bow with her and gestured for her to go back to her seat, back to me. I reached out to take her hand, but all I could think was how cold it was. The day after Uyajin performed, we were due to get our flight back to London. I'd barely touched Lucy all night. Each time I tried to reach out to her, the image of the knife plunging into her flashed through my head, and I pulled back with an involuntary shudder. She'd not spoken about the performance, and nor had I. I was waiting for her to bring it up, to say what happened, but we'd gone to bed with barely a word. When she woke up, she said, "Can our flight be pushed back?" "What?" "I'm not ready to leave Moscow. I need to stay here a little longer." I got out of the bed and stood up, looking down at her. "But we've not got the hotel booked beyond today. We've not got anything booked. The whole plan was for us to—" I know. We'll work it out. I need to stay here." She wasn't looking at me. She was staring out the window at the city, its spires and turrets, its cold majesty. "Is this because of what happened?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "At Uyajin, I struggled to say the words. "The performance." "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. She got out of bed and walked to the bathroom, and I couldn't help but think she was walking strangely, lifting her feet a little too high. "I love you," I said to her back. "Hmm?" "I said I love you." "Oh." She half turned as she walked. "Yes. Love you." A beat settled between us. Maybe she was just tired. "Love you more," I added. She stopped in the doorway, froze, her back still to me. In a distant, haunted voice, she said, "Anything is possible." She didn't pack, so I packed for her. This didn't seem to bother her in the slightest. It was still early, 6 a.m., I think, and the streets were mostly empty. The giant stone archway over the theatre square loomed over us, casting a long shadow towards the Bolshoi Theatre in the slowly waking city. I waved for a taxi. She said, "I'm not coming." "You're being silly. You've got nowhere to stay. I'm not just going to leave you." She shrugged. "Do what you want. I'm staying." "But you—" I shook my head. "You can't." She cocked her head slightly like she was seeing me for the first time. "When do you tell me what I can and can't do?" "But this isn't you. You're not in the right state of mind to make this decision. Not after... I was stumbling, the words spilling out of my mouth before I could stop them. "I can't let you stay here. I won't allow it." She stared at me in response. No words, just the fierce glare of her disappointment. "I don't belong to you," she said. She turned and started to walk, leaving me standing on the pavement with 2 huge suitcases staring helplessly after her. "Lucy," I shouted, swallowing the question that screamed in my brain. "Who do you belong to?" In the end, I got a taxi to the airport, expecting she'd come to her senses and meet me there. I kept expecting it. That she'd show up at the gate just on time. That she'd get on the next flight. That she'd arrive home at our flat a couple of days later, once she'd got whatever it was out of her system. After 2 days back in London, I started calling everyone I could. The Metropole, the British Embassy, the police. But it was too late. Nobody had ever heard of Uyajin. When the circus left town, all sightings of her left with it. All I had left was that single white flag she had stolen, tucked into her suitcase, glaring back at me like a tiny surrender.
That was astonishing. That completely
God.
took me on a journey, my friend. That was really, really, really good.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I mean, just so I was going to ask before about, how do you define weird when you're talking about fiction?
That's how I define
But-
weird.
Yeah.
But no, this is my point. Like, it's not, oh, that's weird. It's almost like weird with a Y,
Yeah.
It's that bending of reality. Like, you both have told so far very haunting stories, but for very, very different reasons.
Mm.
And it's been really interesting as a listener so far to listen to but in both cases, one man's horror, but through entirely different lenses. You know, it's like swapping the monocle from one eye to the other and seeing the world differently. Really, really interesting. And I think especially with the fantastical elements of your story, it was nothing until, you know, that part of the performance, till the resurrection, in inverted commas, in the performance. There were things that were strange without ever crossing the line into unreal, and it blurs that journey so that you do just accept everything that happens. It's very, very elegant, and I was absolutely thrilled and impressed by the whole thing.
I really like that concept of the blurring between the fantastical and the real, to the point where you're not entirely sure which is which. It's something that I really like about the kind of the South American magical realism tradition, and a lot of the kind of stuff that comes out of that genre and that tradition is this sense that fantasy isn't something that's you know, that we're not off to another world where there are wizards and magic and things like that, but that the fantastical elements are just a kind of another side to the world that we see, a kind of an underbelly. If we can, kind of like you said, you can just switch a monocle from one eye to another and see it in a different light, you'll catch some of it. And I really like that atmosphere in stories.
I think you fully captured that. I started writing things down as I was listening to the story, and I just kept on writing things and then going, so well realized afterwards. And then I must have written so well realized 3 or 4 times. There are a few bits that I really did want to talk to you about. The Lucy character grabs you immediately in that story, largely because you don't get the emotions from the main character in the first, what sounds like a few paragraphs. And initially I was thinking, that's really fascinating. What an interesting lens for emotion through a partner. And then that grows and becomes something extremely dark, which is this intense dependency that the narrator has on this woman. And then you see that actually her being the sort of like the one capable of expressing emotion, and him being the one that represses it, is a part of their relationship. And then that leads directly into this sort of the sing-song patterns of birds thing, you know, that call and response, the anything is possible, which provides a wonderful structure to the whole thing. And every step of the way, you're building on the emotions, the drama, the tension. You're expanding the world. You're expanding the depth of our awareness of their relationship and what's good about it and what's bad about it. And just at no point did you lose any pace. There were no down points in that story. It felt really, really tight the whole way through. And I absolutely fell in love with it. I really did. I don't think I've ever quite seen dependency depicted quite so well in so few words.
Thank you. That's very kind. Appreciate that.
The other thing that I thought was extremely well realized was the wonderment at these curiosities. It really put me into that sort of carnival circus tent. I recently watched was it called Nightmare Alley, the Guillermo del Toro movie that came out last year, I think it was. And it definitely gave me that vibe, this kind of like, it's actually kind of gross and scary that these things exist, but it's also filled with wonder, and you trod that line beautifully.
And there is something quite gross about the concept of circuses. I've always found. I think that's why, you know, people always think the clowns are scary and things like that. There's something over the top about them. And that's something I was trying to capture in just coming off the idea that you just said, particularly in the story. There's one moment where they go in and there's a boy called Dimitri with giant wings in one of the tents. And for me, as I was writing it, I was thinking, this is simultaneously wondrous and amazing and beautiful, probably, to look at, but also gross and horrifying that, who is this boy? Why is he being kept in a tent to be shown off like he's in a zoo? There's a real horrifically dark undercurrent to it at the same time.
Absolutely.
With your description of his skin clinging to his ribs and stuff, like this child's obviously is malnourished, is being
or something about
carted out for people.
I was almost wondering on that one, like whether there's something of his strange physiology that means that like he can't put on weight because they're all flight muscles and stuff across his chest. But I did actually pin down what I think it is that created for me, and it actually came from what I was going to say was a critique, that just like very one small tweak that I thought maybe you might want to consider changing the wording. And then by the end of the story, I'd crossed it out because I was like, no, that was exactly the right word to use. And it was when you said biblical tune.
Yeah.
That's a weird way to phrase that because obviously the Bible is a book.
Yeah.
But what it conjures, well, we're talking about this line between the fantastical and the gross, the wondrous and the weird. The meeting point of those two things is awe. And that is what organized religion inspires in people. So when you say biblical tune, it's like that feeling of being in a cathedral and surrounded by the fear and love of God. Like myself, I'm an atheist, so I don't get it, but I've seen it expressed many times. I've never seen it expressed quite in such an approachable way for me than you just did it. So
yeah, I'm glad that came across. I think it was partly that, and it was also partly a desire to kind of foreshadow and kind of segue a movement from performance into ritual, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah.
I think it's particularly interesting as well because a lot of the talk of music in the Bible it's of these like the sounds of heaven, which is what they've been trying to recreate in the church for all this time. It means you end up with incredible pieces of music like Miserere Amadeus, which is like unreal to listen to. It makes you feel all kinds of stuff, but it's still like a pale, waxy comparison to what the Bible describes music to be. So I think it's a cool term to use because you have to try and like the color out of space, the Lovecraft concept. It's like it's a color that you've never seen before, and you can't really imagine that because all of your references are colors that you've seen before. And it's that, isn't it? It's like, well, especially as someone who makes music, what does music that's so good, the capacity we have to create music cannot encompass it, cannot comprehend it? Where does that exist? So it's a good tool for like, but like we keep saying about that blurring that line, to be like, music. Oh yeah, I know music. Yeah, but now imagine music that isn't music because you can't comprehend it. Well, now fuck you. I don't know what that is.
As you can tell from the gushing, I think that is legitimately
shit.
That was great, man. I'm going to be thinking about that story for a while.
Yeah.
So thank you for writing it and thank you for telling it because
and performing it lovely as well.
Yeah, I really
nice
enjoyed the performance. Yes, that horrible coldness of Lucy at the end. I really felt it like a whip crack. I was just that moment that dependency gets severed, and he can't touch her anymore. She's cold. She doesn't return the call and response. Just anyone that's had a relationship breakdown is going to be so invested in that story. Yeah, fantastic. Well done. So Nico, I'm expecting better. I am so glad I went first, man. I am so glad I went first.
Sorry, your call has disconnected.
Okay. Let's go, I suppose.
Like that bullet.
Flags. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat-tat. The snare rattled, morning mist warping the sound into the heartbeats of 1,000 hidden beasts. Slowly, the pipers joined. A long, low note found its way from the bag. Then another, higher pitch joined it. It mixed with the snare to build a wailing monster, stolen from some ancient storybook. At least, that is the intention. It was a concept as old as the instrument, from a time when it had been played on the highlands of Scotland. Not one soldier's presence, father would have been around to see Scotland. The blue planet had been left behind, sapped of its goodness like an apple with its core eaten away. Even still, so far from the tactic's origin, the Third Landed Scots infantry opened every ground assault that way. Strike fear into their hearts. If they have hearts. Know thy enemy came later, after you'd blown them to bits. McNamara shifted the position of his hands on the 12 feet of unyielding steel pole he held. Atop it, a crossbar held a long, fluttering banner. It bore thousands of names. Bloodlines ended in the conflict the unit had taken part in. McTavishes, Campbells, Andersons, all gone, but remembered. Upon them, a rearing unicorn shone luminous white, its horn threaded in with fine strands of silver. They had died with the blue planet. The ancient paintings of military men in their records showed hornless ones being ridden. Those too had been left behind. Not worth the fuel. 1,000 tons of refined insect protein would always be better than the same of hoofed meat. The standard was dreadfully heavy. If it wasn't for the magnetic fiber weave in the palms of his gloves, McNamara knew it would drop to the ground. But it had to be held up by one regular human. It was as much a weapon of psychology as the pipes and the drums. Rat-a-ta-ta-ta-ta, rat-a-ta-ta-ta-ta. The column moved in time with the drum's staccato cry, adding footfalls to its steady violence. Thunder rolled from the boots of the third. McNamara knew he would have been scared were it to come for him. So what hope had any enemy? The third were legendary long before he became a grunt. They'd fought on a dozen infested worlds, cleared the invasive predators, and made homes for trillions of humans cast adrift by their faltered planet. Yet, more children came, and with the race's expansion, so too must their empire expand. There would be 100 forces on this world alone, he reckoned. The united spheres of Europa's berserker priests, branded with their ring of stars. They would be out there casting great sheaths of flame and walking through them, singing songs in tongues so ancient most of their kind had forgotten even the languages that grew out of them. Americana grunt soldiers, great roiling masses of bodies, indoctrinated and starving to give their lives in the name of their ancient dead nation. You could always tell them. The bouncing arches and other strange icons of a forgotten time tattooed on their faces. The Polynesian mech suiters, their colossal war machines scraping gouges from unsettled land, stunning friends and foes alike as they poured voltages beyond measure from their elementary atmosphere rods. And them, the Celt regiments, masters of military history, the last standing, most times. They could call it ancient all they wanted, but a sword has never run out of bullets. McNamara had heard whispers of them, growing in one of the hab ships adrift looking for their next landing zone. As soon as he had enough cycles in him, he joined. And he trained. And he killed. Until now, where he held the company's standard. His red hair braided long, tied beneath his chin in an approximation of a beard he had never managed to grow. It bristled now, in his mind, as he anticipated the clash to come. The intelligence on world Proxima 99 Zulu, designation New Honduras, had been extremely limited. The top brass had issues with the sensors, they said. This was nothing new, lightly atmospheric. They'd dropped blind before, only to surprise half the life out of some primitive creatures banging rocks together. And the blades in their allies' guns did the rest. Rat-a-ta-ta-ta-ta, rat-a-ta-ta-ta-ta. Something felt weird about this world, but McNamara did not have the intellect to place his finger on what it was. He thought that it was quiet, in exception of the thrashing drumbeat and wailing pipes. By now he had expected resistance of some kind. Local fauna, even sometimes the local flora. But this place was just silence and mist and crunchy earth. He realized a moment late he was a number of strides in front of the unit. A hand had been held aloft in the signal for halt. His position at the front and his reverie had placed him out of place. That was lashes. Likely a half dozen for each stride he was out of step. They might even take away his position. He turned to look at the soldier holding the oculator. He spun the dial wildly, the screen flashing through a spectrum of colours. The man looked up, began to scream some words of warning. They were cut short. The ground beneath him caved, and great shining mandibles came from what had once been sturdy floor. They snapped viciously, one of the pair spearing the commsman through the groin, the other puncturing a lung. It didn't pull him in to eat him, simply shredded his form and cast the man aside. Around and among them hundreds of holes were opening. Men pulled metal from well-oiled scabbards. The flashes of colour from repurposed hull, stripped buildings and twisted alien life forms scattered the light wildly in the misty atmosphere. The intervening seconds were mania. Rows of tightly packed warriors seemed to explode upwards or plummet down as the crust beneath them was disturbed. Groups of 60 or so soldiers closed on protruding heads of the alien life forms, their swords bouncing off the glistening exoskeletons. They resembled one of the blue planet's beetles that had been repurposed to foodstuff. Had they been of this size, perhaps the planet need not have been abandoned. There was no time for these thoughts. Rat-ta-ta-rat-ta-ta-ta. Rat-ta-ta-ta-ta. The skittering impacts of the aliens' feet, as they began to swarm from holes around the third, pounded the dry surface. It created a strange, arrhythmic hell. The snaresman pounded relentlessly, trying to keep some order in the ranks. The piper screeched as both his instrument and torso were popped like overripe fruit. McNamara watched it all, lost in his relative silence. He knew all of these sounds, but they were happening in the wrong order. His hands magnetized to the banner, he simply stood and began to think on what he should do. He was not an intelligent man, simply a good soldier. He held the banner high as he could, the muscles of his shoulder wailing like his dying companions around him. He bellowed at the top of his lungs, the sound lost in the maelstrom of auditory savagery around him. He shook the banner high. In his mind, the unicorn upon it reared anew. It whinnied a desperate call. It seemed to say, "Up, ye men, up and upon your foe! Give to them no recourse, and take from them what is ours by divine right. The universe is that of mankind. We must simply have the strength to claim it." He felt himself pulled left hard. A wrenching pop took the ball of his shoulder from the joint and threw him bodily to the ground. In confusion, he looked to his betraying left wing, then traced it to the pole. There, at the end of his left arm, was a glove still magnetized to the pole. Abutted to it was another glove, from which protruded several inches of arm. He looked dumbfounded at his right arm, blood spewing like dehydrated vomit from the strange, perfectly flat wound. Wordlessly, he looked at the alien looming over him. Its eyes, black as space's void, looked into his pain-drenched orbs. To a clever man, they would have said, "This is our world. You may not take it from us." McNamara was no such man. He spat defiance into the beast's open, serrated mandibles. It landed true and mingled with the blood that had once lived in his arm. With no emotion, the natives finished their task against countless forces spread across their hive. Rat-a-tat-tat-ta, rat-a-tat-tat-ta, go the feet of an endless foe. Rat-a-tat-tat-ta, rat-a-tat-tat-ta.
That was like a fever dream of carnage. I fucking loved
That
it.
one, I was not expecting it to go, and I enjoyed it a lot.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
Where were you expecting to go? I'd love to know.
Well, I'm not sure I was expecting it to go anywhere, but I'm not sure the unicorn. Not that I wasn't expecting it to go anywhere. I'm not. That's but like I wasn't. I was invested. I was very much invested in the Braveheart Scottish warriors in space. And then the creepy alien beetles with mandibles, and then the unicorn. I wasn't expecting the unicorn. He was great. Yeah, good. Each little extra element, I was like, I'm into that. I like where this is going.
It was like a mukbang, wasn't it? Of like cool like future war stuff. I wrote down like Starship Troopers, Forever War, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it really felt like a big mix of all of those things. But also, it felt very much like it reached the point that it was its own. Like the Americana grunt soldiers and the Polynesian mechs and the Celts. Like it was somehow not a mess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You kind of like got this like cultural fulcrum regiment thing working for you in a way that I'm not sure I'd be able to do.
It's
And
definitely
yeah,
the first time I've been writing something like this for the pod and gone, oh man, do I fuck this idea off and try and write something way longer with it in? Because I could go on about this stuff for ages.
yeah, I did write down big story, and I think
Yeah.
your instinct there was probably correct, because I think there was so much a really interesting world building and characterization of these different kind of cultures that were being sort of I don't even know, gestated and then vomited onto planets in a forever war kind of scenario. That I would have liked a bigger, almost like a grand science fiction story going along with
Yeah.
it, if that makes sense. And this would have been like one of the characters in that story. That being said,
Okay.
I did really really enjoy it. One thing that I found absolutely wonderful about it was the way that you were describing the wounds that these creatures were giving back to these soldiers. It started with shredded his form, and that is such a weird way to say that someone got torn apart.
Yeah.
Shredded his form, very strange, and it caught my attention. I was like, I don't think I've ever heard that those words used in that order before for this kind of thing. And then later on, you said the strange flat wound, and I thought again, I was like, flat wound. What the fuck is that? That's so weird. And what you captured was that this Forever War unit that just is just dominating planet after planet after planet has finally come up against something that is going to hit back in as strange a way as they hit.
Yeah.
I was really taken with it. I was taken with the whole thing, especially this idea of being magnetized to the banner, this idea of not being able to put it down. Very much, and with all the drumming noise, it very much evoked like this, like drummer boys on Napoleonic battlefields and stuff, just keeping going despite an absolutely crazy scenario happening around them.
I really love that concept of like taking those really old, like historical military ideals and just keeping hold of them, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Mm.
But like even now, it wouldn't be that effective. But you send it against an alien culture that's never fought humans before. Maybe it just works.
Maybe sort of
One of
the
the
skeleton key.
Yeah.
early on was that I really like that idea of kind of this really, really long-term continuation of cultural rituals, even if we don't know why we're continuing them necessarily. That's what humans do. We do things that our forefathers did, and that's part of what it means to be human. And in that sense, it felt very right to me that in this kind of off distant, super into the future, that we still had these really quite archaic cultural relics, because I think we will, and that was portrayed in a way that I don't think I see often enough in distant future sci-fi.
Yes,
It's a really nice compliment. Thank
it
you.
is, that is a nice compliment, because and it's accurate as well, because you often find in these kind of hyper future humanity stories that they're described in an alien way to you, and you have to catch up. You have to figure out how they got there. Whereas this is like, why the fuck have they kept that? Like,
Yeah.
do you know what I mean?
I think one of my favorite bits for that is that someone said, well, it would be a good idea to pick up sword fighting tradition, and obviously they've had to make their own swords out of like bits of discarded ship and old machines and whatever.
And enemies.
But they don't have horses anymore, which means if you're doing that era of warfare, you don't have the most they don't have horses or bows, so they're actually just one part of a trifecta, and probably the least effective part of that trifecta.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Yeah, no, that was a really interesting story. I would very much like you to put together a novella with that as the world. I think that would be a really good, because there were almost too many ideas. How long was that, out of interest?
That is 1447.
I mean, that is not a lot of words, is it? I know it's obviously, yeah.
A lot of ideas for not many words. I'd really like if this was longer form or even different form. The one thing I came out at the end of it thinking is, God, I'd love to hear that almost the same story or a similar story told from the perspective of the beetle aliens, of kind of what they're encountering and what they're seeing from their perspective, and what that must be like.
The humans as the aliens, and having to describe a Scottish Claymore regiment from an alien's perspective. Yeah, that would be fun too.
In space.
It's really spun my mind, man. So well done. I really enjoyed it, and it had loads of fantastic description. Really enjoyed it.
As you know, everyone died at the end, as per. All good.
Lovely it's war.
What is it good for?
Only the dead have seen the end of it, I believe. So I think it's important at this stage that we should say that again, Nicholas's book is coming out next month in April. It's called Ascension. Would you like to give people a bit of an insight into what they're going to be buying?
Yeah, sure. So Ascension is it's a speculative thriller, which is a term that basically means that it's got a bit of fantasy and a bit of sci-fi and a bit of horror, and it's very pacey, packaged into that thriller thing. So if you like those things, that's and similar to what you got a taste of in the story earlier, it gets weird at points. So yeah, that's the book, and it's coming out at the end of April. It's coming out in the UK on the 27th of April and in the US on the 25th of April, and will be available wherever you buy books. So check it out. So I can give a little elevator pitch for it. Is that what's usually done?
Please do. I mean, I think after hearing your writing, I think people are going to be pre-ordering. So definitely a little elevator pitch.
The concept is that a giant mountain, a huge, ridiculously large mountain, taller than Everest, has appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Satellite imagery is like one day it wasn't there, next day it's there. And obviously everyone is going, what on earth is this? But our protagonists, this man called Harold, who's a physicist, is basically recruited by a kind of a pseudo military organization to explore it. And he gets to the mountain, is kind of being they get there as a scientific team to try and work out what's going on. Theirs is actually the second team to attempt to work out what's going on in the mountain. The first team are all dead, except for a couple of people, and one of them being his ex-wife, who has survived, but seems to have gone completely insane. And then, so
No change
basically,
there then.
exactly. And the story is them climbing the mountain and trying to work out what's gone on with it, and kind of working their way towards the summit. And as they do, things get really weird. There's wibbly wobbly timey wimey stuff going on. There's big sci-fi ideas. There's fantastical stuff. There's betrayal and murder. It gets a bit like there's kind of The Thing vibes going on as well, with kind of not knowing who to trust and kind of distrust, as it were. And yeah, that's I'm not going to say any more because anything else would be spoilers, but that's the concept of the book.
Wonderful. And you can get some more information, and you can sort of find the pre-order links and such by going to nicholasbinge.com. And you're also on Twitter at Binge Writing, and I believe Mastodon as well, and Instagram at Nick Binge. So
yes,
go and follow
Instagram, Mastodon. Oh, the link's in my Twitter. I can never remember it. To be honest, I made a Mastodon because my mate Dave bullied me into it, and I've not used it ever. So
should we send people to Twitter then? I think is that and your website.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Right. Well, tune in for the next episode where we're going to do some grilling and digging down into Nicholas Binge and his writing style.
We're going to take this man to the top of a mountain of our own.
Amazing. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La, How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?